Hello and welcome to the training module on how to develop your indirect cost rate. An indirect cost rate is also referred to as the overhead rate. This tutorial will describe the indirect cost rate in more detail. What is an indirect cost rate? Again, otherwise known as the overhead rate. An indirect cost rate is needed on a cost-plus contract to fully compensate you for your indirect costs. Once computed, an indirect cost percentage is applied to your direct costs. Profit is then added to both. I should add at this point that profit is determined by PennDOT and will not be something that you will need to complete. So before we can talk about indirect costs, we should first talk about direct costs. What are direct costs? Direct costs can be considered costs directly associated with work you are performing for PennDOT, including employee compensation, which will be computed on an hourly basis. For example, $35 per hour. Other direct costs are travel-related costs directly related to specific PennDOT assignments. For example, attending a meeting with PennDOT personnel. Other direct costs include lodging while again performing approved PennDOT work, and other costs, which may vary depending on the type of work you are doing, but could include third-party testing costs, reproduction costs, and other related costs. So we just described what direct costs are, so then the question is, what are indirect costs? Indirect costs are costs that are not directly associated with specific work activities, but those are costs that are incurred for the benefit of and to facilitate the direct cost work. For example, employee benefits, payroll taxes, office rent, office expenses, administrative expenses, utilities, professional fees like accounting, legal, etc., advertising and marketing costs, and many, many others. These costs are not directly related to specific work activities for PennDOT, but those are costs that are incurred by your company and need to be reimbursed as part of the work you are performing for PennDOT. The indirect cost rate helps and facilitates the capturing of the indirect costs on your PennDOT projects. So how do indirect costs, again, overhead rates, work? Indirect costs are computed and expressed as a percentage of direct costs. The following example will describe the calculation. If it is determined that indirect costs are 110% of direct costs, then the calculation would be as follows. Your direct costs, which will be computed for 10 hours of work at $50 per man hour, will result in $500 of direct costs. Since we've already determined that your indirect cost rate or your overhead rate is 110% of direct costs, you would apply the 110% to the $500 in direct cost to come up with indirect cost of $550. The sum of the direct costs and the indirect costs would therefore be $1,050. Again, that is the sum of $500 in direct costs and $550 in indirect costs. Profit is then computed on the sum of the direct costs and the indirect costs. In this particular example, profit, which is determined by PennDOT at 10%, will be applied to the $1,050 to yield $105 in profit. Therefore, the total invoice amount in this scenario would be $1,155. That would be the amount of your invoice if you did work for PennDOT for 10 hours and that person was $50 per hour, your overhead rate was 110%, and the profit, as I said, was 10%. Again, going through the calculation, you would get a total invoice amount of $1,155. There are two options that can be utilized to arrive at your indirect cost rate. And again, your indirect cost rate or your overhead rate will need to be determined and submitted to PennDOT for approval via the ECMS portal. Option one to compute your indirect cost rate is to utilize what is described as a safe harbor rate. This option is much easier and less expensive to accomplish than other options, especially for those entities new to this entire process. Although it is easier, option one is likely to result in a lower overhead rate than other options. So there's a trade-off. It's easier to do, but it will result in a lower overhead rate, which would mean less money ultimately in your pocket for every hour that is worked. We will now talk about option two. Option two that can be utilized to arrive at your indirect cost rate is to compute a federal acquisition regulation, also known as FAR, compliant overhead rate. Option two requires specialized skill and knowledge of the FAR and may be difficult to complete for many firms new to this process. However, option two is likely to result in a larger overhead rate than option one, that being the safe harbor rate. How to develop a safe harbor or a FAR overhead rate. Separate training videos are available to explain how to develop a safe harbor overhead rate or a federal acquisition regulation compliant overhead rate. Concluding remarks. Until and unless your overhead rate is submitted to PennDOT and approved by PennDOT, you cannot be approved for any work. You cannot perform any work. You cannot invoice for any work, and you cannot get paid for any work. Therefore, applying for your overhead rate is one of the first tasks that you should perform after you register for work with PennDOT. Thank you for watching, and look for the other two videos to explain how you would compute your overhead rate using either the safe harbor method or the FAR compliant method.